Good evening. Welcome to The History Effect, an online series produced by the History Council of New South Wales. I'm Nancy Cushing, and I'm hosting this week's sessions on the 1918 to 19 pneumonic influenza pandemic, or Spanish flu. Today, we have with us Dr. Kate Ariotti, who will treat the Spanish flu, returned soldiers, and quarantine, protecting Australia from an invisible post-war enemy. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which the History Council's offices in central Sydney are located, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past, present, and emerging. Those of you who've been with us before know the drill, that we've muted you on the way in, but if you have any comments or questions, we'd love to hear from you through the chat function, and I'll put those questions to Kate after her presentation. So I'm really delighted to have Kate with us tonight. She is one of my colleagues in history at the University of Newcastle and has recently taken up a highly competitive ARC DECRA fellowship in the Centre of the Study of Violence there, examining the treatment of corpses during war. More generally, Kate is an historian of war and society and the author of Captive Anzacs, Australian POWs of the Ottomans during the First World War, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. In her talk this evening, Kate is going to treat one of many troubling aspects of the Spanish flu, the need to quarantine troops returning to Australia after having served in World War I. After some of them had been away for years, of course, these men were eager to be at home, and they chafed against the quarantine restrictions. So she'll tell us about what happened when some of those men decided enough was enough. So over to you, Kate.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint up and running. Okay, yes, thank you very much, everybody, for joining me tonight. And I must give a very special shout out to the extracurricular class at Green Shoots International School, who are Zooming in from Hoi An in Vietnam. Now, as Nancy said, I'm here tonight to talk with you about the impact of the Spanish flu pandemic on soldiers who were returning to Australia from the First World War. I'm going to start out by talking about how the Australian troops who were coming home from Europe, so primarily from the former Western Front and from England, in late 1918 and early 1919 were identified as possible carriers of the disease, and how the need to protect Australia from the flu affected their experiences of return. And because I'm associated with the University of Newcastle, and I'm a champion of all things Novocastrian, I'm also going to focus in on some stories of soldiers in quarantine, or rather soldiers in the breach of quarantine, as Nancy alluded to, in the Newcastle region. So the Great War, the First World War, the war to end all wars, as it was referred to at the time, was a global conflict, and it had global consequences. It's estimated to have caused somewhere between 16 to 18 million deaths among the nations involved. Now, the scale and the nature of those losses led to a sense of profound shock around the world when the armistice was declared in November 1918. And this was a shock that was compounded by the absolute devastation that was wrought by what came to be known as Spanish flu, a nasty and very infectious strain of influenza that reached its peak of virulence just as the war ended. Now, there's still a bit of conjecture, I guess, about what exactly caused the outbreak of Spanish flu, but most virologists think that it's likely the virus originated somewhere in the US, Kansas, most probably, among troops in military camps who were waiting to be deployed overseas, and who then, of course, took the virus with them to the battlefields of Europe. But what we do know is that it certainly didn't originate in Spain. It became known as Spanish flu because the censorship demands of wartime meant that the belligerents like Britain and Germany and France, they didn't report any cases among their population. I mean, it's not exactly a morale booster. But Spain as a neutral party, did report cases of flu in their press, including when it struck the King of Spain. And so it became rather unfortunately associated with that nation. So in the 2 years from the first recorded case of the Spanish flu in March 1918, an estimated 50 million people, although some experts put this figure as high as 80 to 100 million, perished from the disease. So that's far more than those killed as a consequence of the war. But the onset of the Spanish flu in a world already ravaged by war seemed too cruel. And as one Australian newspaper of the time commented, what the war left over, the flu-demic is finishing. Now, cases of influenza had been noted in the British expeditionary forces in Europe and in the French military, where it was also called La Grippe, in May 1918. But these were smaller, more localised outbreaks that didn't manifest too severely or spread immediately. And there was something of a lull in incidents of the flu for a few months after that. But later in that year, in October 1918, in the Northern Hemisphere autumn, the flu resurfaced with a vengeance on the Western Front. And during this so-called second wave, some 188,000 French soldiers contracted the flu. In the US Army, it was estimated that 1 in 5 GIs had the disease. And of course, it was also a big problem in the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force. Some 11,700 Australian soldiers on the Western Front were admitted to field ambulances suffering from influenza in late 1918. Another nearly 6,000 were sent to casualty clearing stations, and nearly 5,500 received treatment in base hospitals. So this put enormous pressure on already very thinly stretched Australian Army medical personnel who were simultaneously dealing with the wounded, the shell-shocked, the downright exhausted, and who now had to contend with thousands of soldiers with influenza and its secondary complications like pneumonia. And of course, the virus didn't discriminate. So on the other side of the trenches, some 177,000 German soldiers reportedly received treatment in hospital for influenza between 1917 and 1918. Now, these outbreaks of flu among the troops in Europe were extremely aggressive. Sorry, I've skipped ahead there. And the very nature of the war, or the logistics of fighting the war, all allowed for very rapid transmission of the disease. So think about the very crowded conditions in the trenches, exposure to the elements. The image that you can see of the man standing in the trench there, he's up to his knees in thick mud. That's actually a photograph of Charles Bean, who was the official war correspondent during the war and then later became the official historian. So crowded, cramped conditions in the trenches, the movement of soldiers from the front lines to rest areas where they mingled with civilians, the concentration of sick and wounded in hospitals, the transient populations at military depots and at training camps, and of course the lowered resistance of the soldiers, some of whom had been fighting for many, many years. Now, specific measures were introduced in Australian training and depot camps, as well as in rest camps, to try and stop the spread. Measures that we, of course, today would recognise as social distancing. So, for example, only a certain number of soldiers were permitted to be in a tent at any time. They had to sleep head to toe. Places of amusement, so cafes and the like, were placed out of bounds. Anyone with a high temperature or other signs of illness had to be isolated. And later on, other preventative measures were also introduced, including fumigation, inhalation of a kind of a disinfectant type vapour. And the image you can see in the top left of the screen there is men on a troop ship coming home waiting to be passed through a fumigation chamber. And of course, importantly, inoculation with a vaccine of sorts that was comprised of different bacterial pathogens. So we have to remember at the time that the doctors and the scientists who were working on developing a vaccine for this disease actually had no idea that it was caused by a virus. So Nancy's going to be talking about that more tomorrow, actually. And you can see in that other image on the slide there, an inoculation parade in a medical officer's hut. So these are men who are about to be sent back to Australia, lining up to get their vaccine. So all this is to say that soldiers had clearly been identified as carriers of the disease and potential facilitators of its spread. And as the war ended and thousands of troops were needing to be sent home, this became, as Australian First World War official medical historian Arthur Butler wrote, a most important and difficult problem. Now, some influenza cases had been reported in Australia in July 1918 in both military training camps and among civilians. But this so-called local type was seemingly not as virulent as the pandemic form that developed later in that year. But in October 1918, when Australian government authorities learned that Spanish flu had been detected close by in South Africa, and even closer to home in New Zealand, where it was having a devastating and indeed decimating effect on the population there, they moved immediately to protect Australia's borders and restrict the arrival and spread of the disease. So in keeping with the military kind of parlance of the time, the Commonwealth government declared influenza an enemy that was to be prevented from invading the country at all costs. And in what Arthur Butler called a decision which stands out as one of the most enterprising and courageous in the history of international quarantine, the Australian Director General of Quarantine proclaimed that from mid-October 1918, all vessels arriving at Australian ports from South Africa and New Zealand had to undergo a period of 7 days quarantine, regardless of whether or not they had any identified cases of influenza on board. And all vessels arriving from anywhere else that had definite flu cases during the voyage were also to be quarantined. And these measures proved necessary almost straight away. The troop ship Medic, which was carrying some 800 troops who were actually bound for the war front. They were going to reinforce the troops on the Western Front, had left Australia in November, but on its journey, the armistice was declared and it was basically told to turn around and come home. But during its journey, the ship had called in at Wellington, New Zealand, to refuel, where officers and nurses had been permitted to disembark the ship. And as we know, by then influenza was rampant in New Zealand, and the Medic quickly became a hive of infection. And when the ship arrived in Sydney Harbour, it was placed in quarantine, and the dangerously ill were taken ashore to the North Head quarantine station for treatment. So the disease, fortunately, was confined to quarantine from the Medic, but it had still exacted a very heavy toll. All up, about 300 soldiers from the Medic contracted the Spanish flu. Some 40 died, along with several military nurses who'd been sent to look after the sick at North Head. So the Medic situation had shown just how quickly and how dangerously the flu could spread through a troop ship and indeed beyond. And with the end of the war and the knowledge that there were some 185,000 AIF servicemen overseas desperately wanting to come home, the need to control the arrival of troop ships in Australian ports was clear. Now, as you can see on the slide in Butler's quote here, the authorities were well aware that quarantine restrictions would fall most heavily on the returning soldiers. Quarantine itself was not necessarily a new idea for soldiers of the AIF. Servicemen who'd contracted tuberculosis or, more controversially, venereal disease, diseases that were also considered to be public health concerns, had been placed into isolation for treatment. But the strict Australian quarantine restrictions that were implemented in late 1918 and early 1919 were a source of great resentment. Lack of access to shipping in the immediate aftermath of the war meant that many Australian soldiers had to endure a significant wait in England before they were able to be repatriated, before they were able to get a place on a troop ship. And the journey to Australia was long, it was boring, it was marked by poor rations and quite crowded conditions. So after years of war, the former soldiers were, as the Sydney Daily Telegraph newspaper put it, looking forward to a glorious time as soon as they touched Australia. But quarantine and other restrictions on the gathering of people in public places, which of course included the cancelling of parties and welcome home parades for returned servicemen, delayed these glorious homecomings and proved incredibly frustrating for the soldiers and their families. Tensions between Commonwealth and state governments regarding the implementation of quarantine practices exacerbated this sense of frustration and resentment among the returned soldiers. This was particularly the case here in New South Wales, where the potential spread of the flu was termed a danger greater than war. So in early 1919, the first cases of Spanish flu were recorded in the Melbourne community. And later that month, amid growing controversy that Victoria had not adequately responded to the presence of flu in their state, cases were also reported in Sydney after a returned soldier who had arrived in the city on a train from Melbourne presented at Randwick Military Hospital feeling very ill. The New South Wales government felt, as other historians have argued, somewhat let down by their Victorian neighbour and by the Commonwealth government. And so they began to implement their own quarantine measures independent of the federal policies. So this had a significant impact on returning soldiers passing through New South Wales, because it meant that travel between the states was restricted, including travel across the borders between Victoria and New South Wales. And it also meant the quarantining of all ships arriving in Sydney from a Victorian port, where many troop ships docked to disembark soldiers before continuing on to New South Wales. And this quarantine period was for a mandatory 4 days. So you've got a Commonwealth policy saying 7 days quarantine, and then you've got a New South Wales state policy saying 4 days quarantine as well. Now, one particularly ugly incident in early 1919 demonstrates just how intense these frustrations and these tensions were. So the Argos, which you can see up here on the slide, carrying over 1,000 soldiers returning from the war, arrived in Sydney Harbour on the 6th of February 1919. The Argos had come from Melbourne, where they'd actually taken on soldiers from other troop ships who'd already been disembarked in the city. So this made the ship, in the eyes of the New South Wales government, a potential influenza threat. And as per the regulations imposed by the state government, the Argos was placed under quarantine in Sydney Harbour for 4 days. So the Argos soldiers complained bitterly about the deteriorating conditions on board the ship and the number of delays that they'd endured on their 2.5-month journey from England. They'd also been detained in quarantine at other stages of their voyage, including at Port Said in Egypt, at Colombo, and in Western Australia. Upon the expiry of the New South Wales state-sanctioned quarantine, so after that 4-day period, a medical officer boarded the ship to examine the men, and in a seeming vindication of the New South Wales government's extra precautions, he actually found a case of pneumonic influenza on board. So this meant a further period of 7 days quarantine for the troops of the Argos at North Head Quarantine Station. Upon hearing this most undesirable news, a group of completely fed up soldiers decided to escape. So on Sunday, the 9th of February, somewhere between 40 and 50 men lowered boats from the Argos and rowed to shore. Most, but not all of them, were recaptured, and I'll come back to that point in a minute. The rest were marched off the ship and into a special camp at the quarantine station. Now, conditions at the camp were not great. There were reports, quite sensational reports, that it was infested with snakes, and tempers became more and more frayed. Now, the next morning, the majority of the Argos contingent, so about 900 men, bust out of the quarantine camp, very considerately donned their flu masks and marched through Manly. And at the cargo wharf, they boarded a steamer that had been sent out to take them to Fort Macquarie. And when they got to Fort Macquarie, a very angry state commandant, Major General George Lee, arranged for the men to go to the Sydney cricket ground, where they served out a period of 3 days quarantine. And you can see them there in the slide marching to the SCG, as I said, very considerately wearing their flu masks. So during this time, friends and relatives of the soldiers gathered around the perimeter of the SCG. They demanded to know why the men just couldn't be released. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that one soldier's mother, upon seeing her son in the grounds, had to be forcibly restrained from rushing in to embrace him. And when she heard that he hadn't had anything to eat for some time, she demanded loudly that he be allowed to return to his home, which was only across the other side of the grounds. So that's what's happening in Sydney. But of course, these federal and these state restrictions impacted on soldiers returning to Newcastle and surrounds as well. Quarantine in Sydney meant that they couldn't head up the coast to see their friends and family and homes. They were so close, yet so far. And there wasn't even any prospect of a big welcome back party once they did eventually make it home, because, as I said earlier, there were restrictions on public gatherings to welcome return servicemen. And indeed, a big carnival for returned soldiers that was held at Newcastle Beach in March 1919, when some restrictions were relaxed, had originally been scheduled for earlier in the year, but had, of course, been postponed due to the flu. And even though restrictions had been lifted to allow for that big party, some people, like Patriot here, who wrote into the Newcastle Morning Herald, were clearly very unhappy that these kinds of gatherings were taking place. And he said that a few evenings ago, a welcome was tendered to many returned soldiers in one of our suburbs. All the windows were closed, in spite of the fact that fully 300 people were in the hall. It ought to be recognised that pneumonic influenza is highly infective, and if there had been 2 or 3 carriers present, the whole audience under such conditions would perhaps have contracted the disease. So there was a lot of anxiety in Newcastle about the possible arrival of flu in the region. And this was an anxiety that spilled over into feelings of anger when it was discovered that 2 of the escapees from the Argos were actually hunter locals who had rather incredibly made their way home. Private Charles Bridges of Maitland had rowed ashore from the quarantined troop ship. He had walked to St Leonard's, got on a train to Hornsby, and transferred to another train bound for his hometown. And you might notice in the article there discussing his sensational arrival back in West Maitland, it flags the fact that he hadn't purchased a ticket. So he arrived at his father-in-law's house in Maitland, where his wife and 3 children were staying, at around midnight. And after learning how Bridges had made his way home and of the story behind his sudden appearance, his father-in-law very dutifully reported his arrival to the police. So the house was placed under quarantine for 4 days, and Private Bridges was removed to Maitland Hospital for isolation and observation. Now, the other escapee, Private Samuel White, caused an even bigger stir. White had also made his way home to Newcastle after putting ashore from the Argos and boarding a train at Hornsby. Somehow or other, he'd managed to get a message to friends in the inner city suburb of Cooks Hill, where he lived, that he was en route home. And he was met at Newcastle Station by a big party of people, including the Mayor of Newcastle and Alderman Christie, who later stated that they hadn't known that White had broken out of quarantine. So the little party continued back at White's family home in Dawson Street in Cooks Hill, though his parents weren't actually there because they were in Sydney waiting to meet their son off the ship. The police turned up eventually because they'd been told by Dr. Zions of the Newcastle Hospital, who had been informed himself about White's escape. And the police put the whole house under guard and quarantine for several days. So this meant that Private White, his sister, Alderman Christie and his wife and several members of the Cooks Hill Soldiers Welcome Home Committee were trapped in White's house, where they, according to the Newcastle Herald, attempted to make the best of an awkward situation. Upon being inspected by a local nurse, Private White was found to have a high temperature, and he was very swiftly taken to hospital. But fortunately, he and those who he'd been in quarantine with him in the house did not end up developing Spanish flu. So just by way of wrapping up, Australian soldiers returning from the war were clearly affected by the Spanish flu pandemic. Viewed as potential carriers of the infection, they felt the sting of the quarantine restrictions in particular as their long-awaited homecomings were delayed. The actions of the soldiers on board the Argos and of men like Bridges and White were born out of frustration and perhaps also ignorance as to the seriousness of the disease. But they were not those of the majority. Thousands of Australian service personnel travelled home overseas during the pandemic and abided by quarantine rules and regulations. Despite these strict measures, hundreds of thousands of Australians contracted Spanish flu, and as we saw at the start of tonight's presentation, an estimated 12 to 15,000 Australians died from the disease. And though these figures represent far fewer casualties than in other parts of the world, the flu crisis was still a devastating blow to a country that was already reeling from the loss of 60,000 soldiers and the social and the political and the economic upheaval of the very traumatic years of the First World War. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. And that's been great to hear the Spanish flu from yet another perspective and drawing on your expertise on Australia's participation in the First World War. So the questions are starting to come through, and there's one that seeks to match this topic with your current research interests in the what happens after death. And so have you gone in that direction yet in terms of your research? What happened to the soldiers who died overseas in Europe of the flu? Did they end up with mass graves? Was it that sort of a situation?
No, look, I haven't delved into it too deeply yet, but I don't think mass graves would have been an option, because if they died during the years of the war, they would have been given a military burial. And after the war, when the bodies of the dead were being reinterred into those big, beautiful cemeteries that we know today, taken care of by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as it's now known, they would have been given an individual grave with an individual headstone. The bodies, I do believe, though, that the bodies were deemed to be very infectious still, and so that had to happen quite quickly, the removal of the bodies.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Another question, do you know how representative this experience that you've described of soldiers returning to New South Wales was across the country? Were there similar experiences in other states, or have you looked at that?
Of anger over quarantine or of breaking?
I guess the whole experience of having to stay in quarantine. You said New South Wales added that extra 4 days. Were other states doing that? And yeah.
Well, there was a lot of tension between New South Wales and Victoria in particular, because, as I said, the New South Wales state government felt that Victoria hadn't really followed the rules set down by the Commonwealth government, and so the Commonwealth government actually pulled out and said, "Look, we're going to leave the restrictions that you place on border crossings across your state to you, and the Commonwealth government will just focus on maritime quarantine, so ships arriving from international ports." I do think there was a similar incident of or an attempted breakout of a troop ship. I think it might have been in Brisbane, but I don't know for sure, because I've concentrated mainly on New South Wales and Newcastle. Yeah. But that sense of frustration and anger certainly I would imagine that would have been universal, because they're so close to home but still so far from getting.
Yeah. It's not really a question for you, but one thing that occurs to me, having looked at this and listening to you tonight, is about how the cases are counted now. And so if someone's in quarantine, flies into Australia and is placed in 2 weeks quarantine, and then is found to have coronavirus, we count that as a case. But as I understand, in the Spanish flu, people who were in quarantine weren't counted. You know, we talk about the flu coming to Australia in January of 1919, when really there were cases in quarantine months before that.
Yeah.
And so there's a little bit of a slippage or something there, where Australia's where it's what we now call community transmission.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting being able to use language from today and sort of, you know, think about something that happened so long ago, but it's so...
Yeah, and that was the case of the Medic, the ship that I discussed that was actually going off to war, and when it was told the armistice had been declared and it was sent back, the director of quarantine was quite pleased. He was kind of using that as a bit of a test case to say, look, we can keep this disease confined to quarantine. Because, you know, this is going to work. Obviously, you know, it broke out and started to spread through the community.
Yeah. And so there is just another question. Are there any other comparisons you would make with the present time when you're doing this research and thinking about this particular approach to it? Were there any things that you thought, wow, that's a contrast with what we've just experienced, or this is very much the same?
I don't know. I think the anxiety over quarantine, you know, of people... I don't know. That's quite an interesting question. I think, you know, most people like I said, most soldiers seemed to accept the fact that they were going to have to sit through quarantine and didn't really push it or question it too much. You know, they wanted to ensure that they didn't bring any nasty diseases home to their families. And I think, you know, I don't know, did we see many people try and get out of quarantine recently when they'd been placed in? I can't, maybe a few cases. The fines were very hefty.
And I think for people who ended up in the hotels, that there was also a police presence.
Yeah, guard.
Ensuring that people, you know, in the same way as the troops were somewhat under guard. But I suppose that is the big difference, isn't it? That they're this population that is already under a different level of discipline than the ordinary citizen.
Yeah.
So they're kind of used to taking orders, although...
Yeah, and indeed that the men that broke out of the Argos before they went into quarantine at North Head, those 40 men who wrote, there was discussion about whether or not they should be charged with mutiny. Didn't end up happening, I don't think, but I do think there was some issue about them getting access to deferred pay. So there were penalties for their actions.
Okay, and there's another question, which is probably a non-specific one, but just about how this information was communicated around between different groups and across the state and between the states, because we're so reliant on social media and, you know, digital platforms and so on for sending out all these messages and making sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing, and when that changes and so on, we can get updated really quickly. So, just a question about communications. I mean, you said that the soldier returning to Newcastle had managed to get a message to someone.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that would have been. Telegram, perhaps? I'm not sure. What really interested me was the speed with which the Newcastle newspapers are reporting the presence of the 2 escapees from the Argos. So it's only really a day after they arrive in Maitland and Newcastle respectively that these articles are being published in the press. So, you know, I guess people were aware, perhaps not instantaneously, but, you know, there was transmission of information.
Yeah, and I guess with newspapers, there were morning and afternoon and evening newspapers, and the Telegraph was running hot, and so on, so that information was circulating. We just have a comment from Mary Sheehan, who also works on the Spanish flu, and she said there were examples of soldiers swimming the Murray River to avoid border controls to get home. She doesn't say in which direction, but maybe both directions.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we might wrap things up there. So thank you again so much, Kate. That was really interesting. And I think we can all empathise with those soldiers who broke out of isolation, but also with the authorities who were trying to keep them there. And of course, we've been having those sorts of debates recently. So thanks again to our audience. It was lovely to see so many familiar names there tonight. And I hope you can tune in again tomorrow night, same time, for the final talk, which I will be delivering. And as Kate said, that will be about inoculation. So I hope to see you tomorrow evening. Thank you.